Sub Rosa. Beverly has lots and lots of ghost sex.
Beverly gives a eulogy at her grandmother's funeral at Caldo's colony.
It was a pretty nice eulogy.
And a really ugly priest, who it turns out is also the governor, gives the final words, and as everyone begins leaving, a mysterious man drops a flower on the casket.
And he looks longingly at Beverly, causing her to react in shock.
He is played by Duncan Rager, who I knew as Dracula in the Monster Squad.
Oh, damn, that was the same guy. Beverly asks Troy about the flower, saying it was a very personal gesture. And Picard is talking to the governor alien and his 4 nostrils, and arranges to get the colony's equipment fixed and upgraded in exchange for a tour of the colony. And he also throws in food, because he knows Riker is on the Enterprise.
At one point, Picard says they're due at a starbase the next morning, but he immediately says to hell with following orders and sticking to his schedule, who cares? And the ugly governor tells Picard that all the buildings in Caldo's colony were transplanted directly from Scotland, so as to save money on the filming of the episode.
Beverly is checking out her grandmother's house, which looked pretty damn spacious, and she talks to Troy about being raised by her grandmother.
Beverly shows Troy a supposedly beautiful Howard family heirloom, which consists of a candle holder, and that's it. It's just a candle holder.
And she says the flame symbolizes the enduring family spirit, and says it was always kept lit, and she'll be taking it back to the ship when they leave.
And Troy can already sense where this episode is going, so she decides to leave, saying Beverly could probably use some time alone. And when she goes upstairs, some guy walks in and blows out the candle.
Beverly confronts him, and he says his name is Ned Quint, and he took care of her grandmother's affairs, but Beverly is suspicious, and he says the candle is dangerous and a curse.
And she throws him out, but not before he says he won't be responsible for what happens if she keeps the candle.
I was going to say, if she continues to be in this episode.
The ugly governor hangs out on the Enterprise while Data and Geordi examine the weather control systems. And Geordi finds a power fluctuation in the humidity control, but he can't determine the source. Because this is Star Trek, The Next Generation.
And it's not like they're on the most technologically advanced piece of equipment that humanity has. Data says there's unusual humidity and cloud activity, possibly forming a storm on the planet.
Beverly tells Picard that she's been snooping through her dead grandmother's journals and learned that she had a 30-year-old lover named Ronan.
And Picard is immediately excited to discover that he and Beverly can keep having sex all the way until she's 100 years old.
Beverly says her grandmother met Ronan right after her great-grandmother's death, and she thinks it was the guy she saw at the funeral. She's surprised that her grandmother never mentioned him, but I would just count my blessings that she didn't go into detail about their relationship in person.
And Picard says they'll be around for a few days, so she'll have time to figure everything out. That night, or maybe it's daytime, they're in space, so it probably always looks like that out the window. Beverly is falling asleep when the candle flickers, and we see the sheets and Beverly's nightgown being pulled down.
And she suddenly wakes up to someone saying her name creepily. How romantic. The next day, she tells Troy that she dreamt that she felt a pair of hands sexily moving across her skin that knew exactly how and where she liked to be touched. And she says she fell asleep reading about her grandmother banging Ronan. How romantic.
When Troy says they should actually do some work, Beverly starts touching herself right in the middle of 10 forward. And if I saw the COO of my company sit in the middle of the company cafeteria and start touching themselves, I'd probably head down to HR, but the fact that Beverly was basically sitting with the head of HR is probably tougher for a member of that crew.
Beverly says she hopes she'll have the dream again that night, and Troy suggests reading 2 chapters. And I looked up who the writer of this episode was, and the answer was Brannon Braga, who wrote a lot of TNG episodes, and I came across the piece of trivia that he named Beverly's grandmother after his own grandmother who had recently died, which is even more disturbing.
Yeah. Later, Beverly goes down to the colony and finds Quint tending her grandmother's grave, and she apologizes. She says he can stay at the house once she's gone, but he says he'll never set foot in that house because it's haunted, and not to light the candle.
And he also says the ghost is behind the weather problems.
Before storming off himself. Get it? The storm suddenly picks up in intensity with weird green lightning, and up on the ship, Worf says shit's going down. And Picard asks Data what's going on, and Data dumps out a lot of speech for, I don't know, it got worse.
Geordi tells Picard they should send energy down from the Enterprise to help with the weather control stations. Beverly gets back to the house and finds it full of flowers, and she sees a mirror moving by itself. When she says she's going to call the Enterprise, she starts convulsing, and he asks if she remembers last night. He says his name is Ronan and that he loves her the way he loved her grandmother.
As she's stumbling around in ecstasy, Ronan says he was born on Earth in the 1600s, and he's been with generations of her family, and even moved into space to follow them.
And I had a question. If he was staying with the female line, why did their names stay Howard? We know women still change their names in the future from Beverly Crusher, so did none of the other ones get married down that whole line? Beverly tries to carry on her side of the conversation, but it's hard through all the orgasms.
And she screams at him to stop, but then we immediately cut to the next day, or night. It's hard to tell looking out those windows.
Troy visits her in her quarters, and she seems completely normal. And Troy says she's acting like she's seeing someone.
Beverly says she met Ronan, and now she is involved with him. And Troy says she's very happy, but the death of Beverly's grandmother could just be a catalyst bringing the two of them together,
creating the illusion of closeness and romance. How romantic. The ugly governor and Picard go to the bridge, and they find a layer of fog over everything.
Worf and Riker say they're getting feedback from the colony's weather stations, and I was curious to how that would work, because they're just sending them power, right?
Yeah, doesn't make sense. And when Data tries to disengage from it, he finds a feedback loop in the transfer beam.
So he can't shut it down. That doesn't make any sense.
And Worf says that other parts of the ship are also malfunctioning, with some parts going below freezing or losing gravity, but of course we don't see any of that, because that costs money.
Data and Geordi go to check out one of the weather stations and find Quint yanking a bunch of crap out,
saying he's trying to kill us all.
And when they try to stop him, he ends up getting zapped.
And when Data checks him out, he says he's dead. Later, Data and Geordi tell the ugly governor that the weather problems will continue,
and that Quint was trying to shut the entire system down,
while they just kind of watched and didn't really do much to stop him.
They politely asked what he was doing, so that's not entirely true.
And Beverly says that Quint wasn't killed by a plasma discharge like they thought, but that he has some anomalous residual energy in his body, which Data says matches the energy fluctuations from the weather control system.
Beverly has Quint's body sent back to the Enterprise, but does not go back herself. She instead goes to the house to ask Ronan about the incident. Ronan appears and says they can't talk about that. Beverly needs to light the candle to keep him alive, and he can travel along the power transfer beam back up to the ship, and then they'll be together. And then he turns into green mist. So, is he Dracula? Is this some sort of weird crossover? Because that would have made this episode way cooler.
Beverly beams up to her quarters and lights the candle, then gets all antsy waiting for Ronan to appear again.
I said Ronan withdrawal.
Suddenly he appears from behind her and says he's going to become part of her, just like with all her ancestors. And he turns into green CGI and starts flowing into her. How romantic.
Later, we see her in the transporter room with a bunch of luggage, and Picard runs in and confronts her because she has apparently resigned from Starfleet to stay on the colony.
And I like how she keeps trying to cut Picard off by just saying, energize.
But he eventually lets her leave. The end.
Picard talks to Troy, who says Beverly was holding something back.
Picard then very quizzically asks if perhaps this Ronan is the reason why a main character of the show, whom he just claimed a few episodes ago to have loved for the past 10 years or whatever, has taken this completely out of character and radical action. And Troy says, maybe. And I thought it was funny that they both agree that Beverly is free to make her own choice, even if they don't agree with it, when this entire show regularly revolves around them forcing others to make decisions if they don't agree with them.
Data comes in to tell Picard that they detected the same unknown energy signature in the cemetery, so Picard tells him to go down and check it out. And in the meantime, he wants to meet Ronan.
Geordi and Data find that the energy readings are coming from Beverly's grandmother's grave, and I was waiting for them to just start blowing the ground up with their phasers. But we cut away to Beverly and Ronan.
Ronan turns into green mist again and goes inside her, saying they are almost merged. Then Picard walks in and catches Beverly in the middle of enjoying herself.
He says he wants to meet Ronan and notes that Beverly's eyes are a different color. And she says, yeah, I just changed it.
It's the future. We have contact lenses.
He says he preferred her as she was before and suspects that something is afoot.
Ronan suddenly descends the stairs, and Picard questions him, but all he says is that he is from Scotland, because that's all the writers came up with.
Data interrupts and says that the energy is coming from the coffin underground, and Geordi wants to dig her up, but Ronan says they can't. Picard says they're going to do it, and Ronan says he'll go to the governor. Picard calls his bluff and starts barraging Ronan with questions about his origins, so Ronan turns to mist and zaps Picard.
Beverly pulls out her medical equipment. Ronan tells her to come with him and tries to pull her away, but she resists. And Ronan says he has to stop the others, so he leaves.
Picard eventually wakes up, so Beverly runs out to find Ronan, and meanwhile the coffin is beamed above ground, which was far less exciting than blasting away all the dirt. And for some reason, the space that would no longer be displaced by the coffin doesn't cause the whole thing to just fall into the ground all over again.
Data says the weird energy is in Beverly's grandmother's body, which suddenly opens its eyes and sits up and zaps both of them with green electricity. How romantic. Then Beverly shows up and tells Ronan to quit desecrating her grandmother's corpse, because there's only so much that the sensors will let through.
She says the same energy is slowly seeping into her own body, and Ronan is some sort of anaphasic life form, and since that form of energy is unstable, it needs an organic host.
She says he's been using her family for centuries, but he says he loved all of them, and tells her to give him the candle or he will kill Geordi, which he demonstrates by shocking him again.
So she puts the candle down, but then blasts it with a phaser. And she moved really slow. Ronan definitely would have had time to stop her.
Yeah, especially since he can apparently zap people from a distance. She tells Riker to shut down all connections to the weather control systems, and he calmly complies without asking any questions.
But I did think it was a surprisingly good move on her part to think of that in that moment.
Yeah, the writers must have slipped up. She points the phaser at Ronan and tells him he has nowhere else to go, but he says he does and starts moving toward her, so she zaps him. And before he disappears, he says he loves her.
We get a captain's log saying Geordi and Data are cool, but Beverly's recovery will be much harder. In 10 Forward, Beverly says Ronan realized that one of her ancestors had a compatible biochemistry, but how would she know that? That seems like a guess.
And she says she's sad because based on her journal entries, Ronan clearly made her grandmother very happy. In other words, she wishes they could have banged some more before she had to kill him. How romantic.
And during this whole conversation with Troy, the close-ups show their faces and they're looking directly at each other. But there's a giant-ass 8D space chess set smack dab in the middle of those chairs. That really bothered me. Sub Rosa. Overall?
What a dumb episode, what a dumb concept, what dumb execution. This episode has nothing to offer other than seeing Beverly orgasming all over the place, if that's what you're looking for.
But you always talk about how hot Beverly is.
Ah, I knew you were going to say that. that doesn't mean it's a good episode, even for me. Oh, man.
This episode was made for you.
Whatever. Duncan Rager was wasted as Ronan, but he did do a good job of seeming like a womanizer and then going into straight creep mode. The idea behind his character was interesting in the sense that it was unusual and unique, but that doesn't mean it was a good idea. From a sci-fi angle, this episode had nothing to offer because it really focused on Beverly from more of a personal perspective, but from a character angle, it didn't have much to offer either. We never found out anything about Beverly's thoughts on the whole thing, other than her being very horny the whole time. That's literally all we know.
Do you think maybe she was in a relationship with the writer?
Interesting idea. The way she was acting, with making rash decisions and not talking to anyone about it, made it seem like she was being manipulated like Picard suggested, but then later she turned against Ronan very quickly, so it doesn't seem like anything like that was happening. She seems to have accepted him of her own volition, which even happened off-screen, very suddenly, and then she turned against him, also of her own volition. How did Ned know about the candle, or Ronan? And if he was that serious about stopping him, his way of taking action was incredibly incompetent, from his first interaction with Beverly, where he just busted in and tried to take the candle and made an ass of himself, to breaking into the weather station and just randomly tampering with random stuff. Nothing in this episode made sense. Nothing in this episode was compelling or interesting, and I'm surprised I could even find that much to talk about, because this episode is mostly just Beverly banging a ghost. I gave it an F.
I went a little bit outside of our constraints, and I gave it a G. Partially because it's so dumb, but also G for ghost. There were so many points in this episode where I had to pause because I was just laughing too much. What did Gates McFadden think reading this script? What did the other actors think reading this script? And the script has to pass through producers and crap, right? So Brannon Braga wrote this script, I assume, under the cover of night. It's like fan fiction. But then missed his deadline and said, shit. Here, this is the next episode. And they said, yeah, this is good. Let's do this. Can you imagine someone asking, what are you watching? And you reply, Star Trek. And you're watching this episode? What if someone had never tried watching any episode of Star Trek and they just happened to start with this one? It's such a weird thing.
Think about somebody walking in on you while you're watching this episode.
I thought it was really strange that the first time Beverly felt herself being groped by someone that wasn't there, her first instinct was to tell Troy how awesome it felt. And not, hey, you know how multiple members of this crew, including you, Troy, have been violated, raped, and impregnated by strange, often intangible entities? Well, I think that's happening to me. We should turn on Red Alert pronto. Who made the candle? How did that work? He had been with Beverly's ancestors over centuries.
Where did the candle come from? If it's burning plasma or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or is it only burning plasma because he's the one? I don't know. It's whatever. I don't know.
Did he, as this anaphasic life form, have to be with a member of Beverly's family? Beverly speculated he found some sort of biochemistry compatibility, but that's just a guess. And if it did have to be with a member of her family, did it have to be a woman? Was Ronan's form locked as that dude? What if there were no daughters for a certain generation?
Yeah, well, he did say that her line was the most beautiful women he'd ever encountered or whatever.
But that could have been just because he was compatible with them.
Yeah.
Could he have latched onto some other form of life as a host? It seems weird that he could basically force these women to do whatever he wanted, and he never said, let's go out into space and look for another way for me to survive that doesn't involve living inside of a candle.
Well, also, if he's just a life form that's out there in space, how are they surviving out there?
Yeah, if they're so unstable.
And how did he come to Earth?
Well, hopefully that will be answered in Picard Season 3. And the statement to seek out new life and new civilizations, as long as they agree to follow our rules. And if they try and bang us, well, how we react to that is sort of on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we get mad and sometimes we're cool with it. I thought the other two characters in this episode, the ugly governor and Quint, were both ridiculous and acted like goofy-ass cartoon characters. Also, when the governor sneezed from the fog, I noticed he only covered the bottom two nostrils. Total missed comedic opportunity to have Picard get sprayed by side nostril snot. Of course, this will never come up again, even though it should. I don't know how Troy or Picard can never look at Beverly and not immediately think of this incident. And Beverly's resignation had to go through other channels, right? And she and or Picard and or Troy has to file a mission report or log or something, right? It is out there. The record of this incident is out there, and they can't pretend it didn't happen because they would have had to report that a colonist died and the chief engineer of the flagship almost died. Very embarrassing.
Yeah, and Beverly will have to retract her resignation.
And she's such a prominent medical figure in Starfleet, she's going to be speaking at conventions and forums and crap, right? She's going to get up on that stage and people are going to go, hey, that's that woman that had sex with the ghost. Do you remember reading that report? Maybe she'll be heckled on stage. I'm trying to think of what they would say.
Boo.
So this episode happened.
You're welcome, everyone.
There's nowhere to go but up. Even if the next episode is bad, it can't be as bad as this one.
Let's hope.